The uncomfortable truth is this: the more a man tries to be chosen, the less he is chosen. Not occasionally, not by chance, but consistently, across cultures, eras, and personal stories that seem different on the surface, yet obey the same invisible law underneath. Men are raised to believe that interest creates attraction, that presence proves value, that emotional availability builds love. Reality punishes that belief again and again. The men who invest first are often overlooked, while the men who remain emotionally untouched become unforgettable. This is not romance failing. This is power dynamics expressing themselves through desire. Attraction does not respond to effort. It responds to position. When a man seeks validation, he places himself below the woman he wants without realizing it. He communicates need before value, and need, in every human interaction, dissolves leverage. This pattern is ancient. Long before modern dating narratives, Machiavelli observed that people do not attach themselves to those who serve them, but to those who cannot be easily possessed. Desire follows autonomy, not devotion. The man who shows no interest threatens control, and the unconscious reads that threat as value. This realization is destabilizing because it forces a brutal reassessment of what men are taught about love, masculinity, and worth. And once you see this mechanism, you cannot unsee it, because attraction is not governed by morality, it is governed by strategy. Desire is not moral, it is strategic. Most men lose before anything begins because they confuse ethics with attraction. They believe desire rewards goodness, effort, and emotional honesty. That belief feels noble, but it is psychologically naive. Desire does not operate on fairness. It operates on advantage. It scans for signals of strength, direction, and self-command long before it considers intentions. A man can be kind, loyal, and emotionally open and still generate no attraction at all. That fact alone should force a re-evaluation. Attraction is not a conscious choice. It is an unconscious response to position. When a man centers his behavior around being liked, he unknowingly broadcasts that his emotional state is negotiable. He reveals that approval from the woman carries weight in his internal hierarchy. The unconscious mind reads this immediately, not as affection, but as imbalance, and imbalance weakens desire. The problem is not that he cares. The problem is that his caring precedes leverage. Desire ignites when a man appears internally anchored, when his actions are driven by a life that moves forward regardless of who approves. This creates asymmetry, and asymmetry creates tension. The woman senses that she is not the axis of his world, that uncertainty activates curiosity. Curiosity creates attention. Attention, when unanswered, becomes emotional investment. This is why morality fails as a strategy. Moral behavior seeks harmony. Desire feeds on contrast. When a man offers reassurance too early, he removes psychological friction. He answers questions that should remain open. He makes himself legible before being valued. The unconscious mind does not reward that transparency. It files it under safety, not attraction. Understanding this is uncomfortable because it challenges the idea that being good guarantees being chosen. It does not. Being positioned does. And until a man separates his self-worth from his need to be desired, he will keep unknowingly working against himself, because desire is not moved by what you intend to give. It is moved by what you could withhold without losing yourself. And once this sinks in, another question emerges. If desire responds to position, not pursuit, what exactly signals that position without words? That is where the mechanism becomes invisible. The invisible signal of self-sufficiency. What attracts is not disinterest, it is self-sufficiency. The man who appears uninterested is often misunderstood because people focus on what he does not give rather than what he already possesses. He is not compelling because he withholds attention. He is compelling because his emotional center is closed, not cold, not hostile, but complete. He is not searching for something to fill him, and that completeness is felt instantly, without explanation. Emotional self-sufficiency sends a signal that bypasses logic. It says this man does not need emotional extraction to function. He does not require constant affirmation to stabilize his identity. His mood is not a referendum on how he is perceived. This makes him heavy, difficult to move, hard to influence. And in every social and intimate dynamic, what cannot be easily moved gains value. When a man needs less, he becomes unpredictable in the right way, not chaotic, but sovereign. His choices are not reactions, they are decisions. This shifts the entire dynamic. The woman senses that her approval is not the fuel of his direction, and paradoxically, that is when approval becomes something she wants to give. This is where Machiavelli's realism applies with brutal clarity. Power belongs to the one who does not need to ask. The one who is not dependent is the one who cannot be controlled. Emotional independence functions the same way. The man who does not lean emotionally forces others to adjust to him, not through force, but through gravity. This is why self-sufficiency creates attraction without effort. It restores hierarchy, not an imposed hierarchy, but a natural one. The man stands as a point of reference rather than a seeker, and once a man occupies that position, interest reverses direction. Attention flows toward him instead of away. But this stability creates a side effect most men never anticipate. The moment a man stops chasing, he also stops explaining himself, and that silence introduces something far more powerful than presence. It introduces mystery, and mystery is where attraction either deepens or dies. Why pursuit collapses. Pursuit feels productive, but psychologically it is destructive. The moment a man begins to chase, he begins to explain himself. His intentions become visible, his emotional direction becomes legible, and mystery collapses. Attraction does not survive full illumination. It needs shadow. It needs unanswered space where imagination can operate. When a man pursues, he accelerates familiarity. He reduces uncertainty. He replaces tension with reassurance. This feels kind, even mature, but it quietly dismantles desire. The unconscious mind does not attach deeply to what it fully understands. It attaches to what it cannot yet map. What remains slightly out of reach commands attention. What is easily accessible becomes background. Desire feeds on projection. A woman does not fall in love with what she knows. She falls in love with what she imagines. Pursuit removes the raw material imagination needs. Every extra message, every premature confession, every emotional clarification fills in gaps that should remain open. And once the gaps are closed, emotional momentum stalls. This is why excessive clarity feels suffocating. Not because it is wrong, but because it arrives too early. Clarity without value strips tension. It removes the possibility of discovery. The man becomes predictable, and predictability comforts, but it does not magnetize. The unconscious seeks stimulation, not certainty. The man who does not pursue leaves questions unanswered, not deliberately, but naturally. His life does not revolve around managing someone else's perception. He does not rush to define the dynamic. He allows space. And in that space, the woman begins to lean forward mentally. She wonders, she speculates, she fills silence with meaning. This is the silent reversal most men never see. The less he explains, the more she interprets. The less he clarifies, the more she invests. And without realizing it, the pursuit shifts sides, because the mind cannot tolerate unresolved tension for long. It either disengages completely or moves closer. And that unresolved tension, when sustained, becomes a trap. Not an emotional game, but a psychological mechanism. One that pulls attention inward and refuses to let go. That is the next layer, the imagination trap. When emotional distance appears, the mind does not relax, it works. Silence is never empty. It becomes a canvas. And the moment a man stops filling every gap with reassurance, the woman's imagination steps in to do the work for him. This is not manipulation. It is how the psyche responds to uncertainty. Uncertainty activates rumination. Rumination turns into emotional occupation. The mind circles unanswered questions because unresolved patterns demand completion. When a man is present but not emotionally exposed, he becomes mentally loud, not because of what he says, but because of what he does not confirm. The absence of clarity creates a pressure loop that keeps attention locked. This is why emotional distance increases investment instead of reducing it. The woman begins to replay interactions, searching for meaning. She assigns depth to neutrality. She interprets restraint as strength. And the more she interprets, the more ownership she feels over the narrative she is building. What she creates internally begins to matter more than what actually exists externally. Desire deepens when the mind participates in constructing the bond. Emotional imagination forges attachment faster than reassurance ever could. This is why over-availability is so damaging. It leaves nothing for the psyche to work on. It offers finished answers where questions are needed. The man who is emotionally self-contained does not feed this loop intentionally. He simply refuses to manage someone else's emotional certainty. His life continues. His attention is directed, not dispersed. And that refusal forces the other person to move mentally toward him or detach entirely. Here lies the risk. This mechanism does not create casual interest. It creates polarity. Either the woman disengages or she invests deeply. And when she invests, she does so internally first, long before words are exchanged, long before feelings are admitted. But this power is often misunderstood. Many men assume that creating distance requires cruelty or arrogance. That assumption leads to failure, because true leverage does not come from being cold. It comes from being grounded, and that distinction changes everything. Power without cruelty. Indifference is often confused with dominance, but they are not the same. Cruelty is reactive. Arrogance is noisy. True power is quiet and contained. The man who generates attraction through self-control does not withdraw to punish or provoke. He remains steady because he is not internally pulled by the need to be liked. Power without cruelty comes from emotional regulation. When a man does not overreact, does not over-explain, and does not chase reassurance, he communicates stability. Stability creates safety, but not the soft safety of predictability. It creates the safety of strength, the kind that does not collapse under pressure or demand constant validation. This is where many men fail. They imitate detachment without developing the internal structure to support it. They become cold instead of grounded, hostile instead of composed, and hostility repels. It signals insecurity, masked as control. Women sense the difference instantly. The psyche recognizes when distance is defensive rather than sovereign. A grounded man does not need to signal power. He does not posture. He does not withhold affection as leverage. His restraint is not a tactic. It is a byproduct of self-command. He can engage without losing himself and disengage without resentment. That emotional neutrality is what creates respect. Machiavellian strategy here is often misunderstood. It is not about manipulation through fear. It is about maintaining position through stability. The man who cannot be emotionally hijacked remains ungovernable, and what cannot be governed commands attention. This is the paradox. The more emotionally controlled a man is, the more space he allows others to reveal themselves. He observes instead of reacting, and in that observation, dynamics become visible. Women do not fall for cruelty. They fall for the man who cannot be shaken. But power has another silent component that most men overlook: availability, not whether it exists, but how consistently it is offered. And this is where attraction quietly drains away without anyone noticing. Why consistent availability feels common. What is always available loses weight, not because it lacks quality, but because the mind stops assigning value to what requires no effort to access. This is not emotional cruelty. It is psychological economy. The brain conserves attention for what feels limited, uncertain, or selective. When a man offers constant access to his time, emotions, and attention, he unintentionally flattens his own presence. Consistent availability removes hierarchy. It communicates that nothing else competes for his focus, that her attention sits at the top of his internal structure, and once that hierarchy is revealed, attraction weakens, not consciously, but biologically. The unconscious mind equates constant access with low cost, and low cost signals replaceability. Predictability comforts, but it does not excite. Comfort is stable, familiar, and safe. Desire is unstable, alert, and charged. When a man becomes emotionally predictable, he shifts categories. He becomes reliable, but not magnetic, present, but not compelling. The dynamic loses polarity. This is why emotional availability must be earned, not withheld, but paced. When attention arrives too easily, it loses impact. When it arrives selectively, it gains significance. The man who distributes his energy intentionally communicates that his life has structure and priorities. That structure becomes attractive because it suggests direction. This does not mean disappearing or playing games. It means refusing to collapse your life around another person too early. When a man remains engaged with his purpose, friendships, and direction, availability becomes contextual rather than constant, and context preserves value. Once availability is no longer guaranteed, something shifts. The woman begins to sense that access is conditional, not on performance, but on alignment. And that realization triggers a psychological pivot, because the moment access is no longer assumed, attention sharpens. That pivot is the moment when pursuit changes direction, when interest becomes effort, when curiosity turns into movement, and that moment is unmistakable. The moment women realize they are chasing, there is a subtle psychological shift that occurs when a woman realizes she is no longer being pursued, but is instead the one leaning forward emotionally. It does not announce itself. It emerges quietly. Through contrast, the man has not withdrawn. He has not become cold. He has simply remained centered in his own life. And that stability exposes a gap. The gap is this: she is no longer the gravitational center of his attention. His time, focus, and direction do not reorganize around her presence. That realization creates friction, not insecurity in the childish sense, but awareness. Awareness that his interest is selective, that access to him is not automatic, and that awareness sharpens desire. Attraction deepens when validation is absent, but respect remains. The man still listens. He still engages. But he does not overinvest emotionally. He does not seek reassurance. He does not chase resolution. His presence is calm, but not consuming. That restraint invites pursuit without force. This is where roles invert. The woman begins to test proximity. She initiates more. She seeks clarity. She looks for signs of exclusivity, not because she is manipulated, but because her mind is responding to a perceived imbalance. The human psyche moves toward what feels slightly out of reach. Importantly, this is not about control. The man does not change behavior to provoke chasing. He remains unchanged. That consistency reveals who is adjusting, and the one who adjusts is the one who invests. Once this inversion happens, emotional attachment accelerates, because the woman's sense of agency becomes tied to securing a position in his world. And the moment someone feels they must earn access, they value it more. But this inversion carries a warning most men ignore. Being desired does not mean being safe. Power without understanding its cost leads to loss. And this is where Machiavelli's most uncomfortable insight becomes unavoidable. Machiavelli's warning about being too loved. Machiavelli understood something that modern romance prefers to deny. When affection carries no consequence, it loses weight. To be loved without the possibility of loss is to be taken for granted. In his language, fear was never about terror. It was about consequence, about knowing that access, favor, and position are not guaranteed. Translated into modern relationships, fear becomes something quieter and more psychological. Fear of loss, fear of irrelevance, fear of becoming emotionally invisible. When a woman knows a man will remain regardless of how she behaves, attachment weakens. Not because she is cruel, but because certainty removes urgency, and without urgency, desire decays. Love that carries no risk invites neglect. Emotional investment follows perceived stakes. When there is nothing to lose, there is nothing to protect. This is why men who are endlessly forgiving, endlessly present, endlessly available, often find themselves slowly disregarded. Their presence becomes a constant background noise rather than a signal. This does not mean threatening abandonment or manufacturing fear. It means maintaining standards, boundaries, a life that does not collapse around one relationship. When a man's respect for himself outweighs his fear of losing someone, his presence gains gravity. He becomes someone whose absence would be felt. Machiavelli's insight was never about domination. It was about structure. Relationships without structure drift toward imbalance. And imbalance always ends the same way. One side disengages while the other is left confused. The uncomfortable truth is that love survives best when it is accompanied by the possibility of loss. Not cruelty, not volatility, but consequence. And the man who understands this no longer clings to affection as proof of worth. Yet many men only grasp this principle after paying a heavy price. After loyalty, presence, and investment are met not with commitment, but with replacement. And that realization leaves a scar. The cost of learning this too late. Most men do not encounter these truths in theory. They encounter them through loss, through the quiet shock of realizing that loyalty, presence, and emotional investment did not protect them. They did everything they were told was right. They stayed consistent. They prioritized the relationship. They made themselves available, and still they were slowly deprioritized, replaced or discarded. This is where confusion turns into pain, not because the man was weak, but because he was uninformed. He played by moral rules in a game governed by psychological ones. He assumed that effort created security, that sacrifice built attachment, that being needed guaranteed permanence. Instead, his availability erased consequence. His loyalty removed tension. His predictability dissolved desire. The tragedy is not rejection. The tragedy is misinterpretation. Men blame themselves for being insufficient when the real mistake was structural. They gave what should have been earned. They invested before position was established. And once a man gives from a lower position, every additional effort deepens the imbalance. This moment leaves a mark. It either breaks a man or forces him to evolve. Some retreat into bitterness, convinced that detachment equals cruelty. Others wake up. They realize the cost was not caring, but caring without sovereignty. Not loving, but loving without boundaries. Pain, when understood, becomes instruction. It strips away illusion. It reveals that self-respect is not selfishness, and restraint is not indifference. It teaches that desire does not grow from sacrifice alone, but from direction, consequence, and self-command. And once a man integrates that lesson, he cannot return to who he was, because the final shift is not about women at all. It is about identity, about stepping out of the role of emotional supplier and into something far more stable, the new masculine position. The transformation does not begin with changing how a man treats women. It begins with changing how he treats himself. The old position was built on reaction, on adjusting behavior to maintain interest, on offering more whenever distance appeared. The new position is built on direction, a life that moves forward regardless of who is watching. In this position, a man is no longer an emotional supplier. He does not negotiate his worth through availability or sacrifice. His time, attention, and presence are expressions of alignment, not attempts to secure attachment. He chooses, but he does not cling. He engages, but he does not chase. This shift is not indifference. It is sovereignty. The man becomes internally ordered. His priorities are clear. His boundaries are firm without being hostile. His emotions are regulated without being suppressed. And because his identity is no longer dependent on being desired, desire begins to appear naturally. Women respond to this not because it is calculated, but because it is rare. A man who does not need to be chosen communicates that he has already chosen himself. That self-selection changes everything. It restores hierarchy without force. It creates attraction without performance. This position also brings peace. The man no longer oscillates between hope and anxiety. He does not interpret every interaction as a referendum on his value. He observes, he decides, he remains grounded regardless of outcome. And here is the paradox that completes the cycle. The moment a man stops needing to be chosen, he becomes choosable. Not to everyone, but to those who sense strength, direction, and self-respect. What remains now is not another technique, but a realization. One that alters how past experiences are understood and future choices are made. Once you understand this, you stop asking why someone lost interest and start asking why you surrendered position. You see past relationships differently, not with resentment, but with clarity. You realize that attraction did not fade because you were insufficient, but because you made yourself consequence-free. This is the realization that cannot be undone. Desire does not attach to effort, it attaches to direction. It does not grow from how much you give, but from how firmly you stand. The moment a man organizes his life around being chosen, he becomes optional. The moment he organizes his life around who he is becoming, he becomes magnetic. From this point forward, you stop performing. You stop over-explaining. You stop trading self-respect for temporary approval. You allow people to meet you where you stand, not where you bend. And those who cannot adjust fall away naturally. This is not a rejection of connection. It is a return to balance. Because love that survives without structure decays, but love that respects strength endures. And once a man understands this, he no longer fears loss. He understands that what leaves was never aligned with who he is becoming. That is the difference between being liked and being chosen. And once you see it, you never unsee it.